Hello and welcome to the video. In today's video we're going to be talking a little bit about the setup for the switch panel, and this is going to be a push button start switch panel you typically find on Amazon or eBay. And let's go ahead and jump right to the back here, where a lot of users, even such as myself, have questions regarding the setup. A lot of these, as we know, do not come with instructions. They may come with a diagram. But for many users who don't work on a day-to-day basis with this type of stuff, it can be quite confusing. So I just want to make a video offering a little bit of insight to that. And definitely, if you have any questions, go ahead and leave those in the comments. Myself and others can help jump on those and answer some questions. Hopefully by the end of today's video, everything will be answered. A lot of this information, I want to thank some other YouTubers. I'll go ahead and leave their names in the description. A lot of this information is based off of what they've already provided. I still had some additional questions and later found the answers to those, and so I wanted to make a detailed video explaining the setup. Now, the video itself may be quite lengthy. If you want to check the description, you can view some different timestamps of when you may want to skip to jump to a certain section. We're going to be talking about the actual setup itself. We'll also be later installing in the car and showing, even if you don't have a wiring diagram that you've located online, we can even show you how to find the pin out yourself using a multimeter, and we can show that in the actual vehicle. So there's going to be a multi-part to the video here. So let's go ahead and actually jump into the setup. The first thing we want to talk about here is the actual on-off switch. This is going to be the main on-off switch to the entire circuit. As we know, this is going to kick on the ignition, which will then provide power to the rest of our switches here. And then mainly we want to be discussing the first two here, which is going to be our momentary push button start for the starter. Now when we jump into the back, we're going to notice that this first switch here has 3 terminals. These are the pins 1, 2, and 3. Compared to the accessory switches, which only have 2. The purpose of that is the ground is simply for the LED function here right on the front, or feature, and the same thing for this pin number 2, and we'll jump into that and I'll show a little bit more better lighting as I come closer here. But let's talk about this part here for the push button switch. When you look at it, there is an X1, an X2, a 3, and a 4. Now, you can actually move this. It may come from the seller or from the factory installed right over 1 and 2. You can just unscrew this Phillips head right here, and that'll disconnect from this receiving portion down here. Now, as you see, it can either be moved on this side and mounted or on this side. Now, when we actually push the button, if you want to get close here, we can see this. As the button is then pushed in, it raises these little plastic tabs, these points here. So the switch can be mounted on either side. And what that will do here is it will just compress this, which will then join these together. So when we go ahead and set this up briefly for the demo, we'll go ahead and show that. Now, let's go ahead and grab this multimeter. We're going to put it on continuity mode. I'm just going to switch it to an audible signal, showing that there's connectivity. We'll go ahead and put this through here and just tighten that down briefly, and then over here as well. Now we'll see that currently there's no signal going through it. As soon as this is pressed in, it then joins the 2. And so if you had 12 volts going in, for example, once you join, it's going to have that current, or at least the voltage will then carry on throughout the circuit. So let's go ahead and actually do the setup. As I said, be quite a long video, just offering some technical details and some explanation to the actual parts here. So right here, as I said, it can be mounted on either side. I like to personally mount it on this side. That way I then still have access to 1 and 2. And so you will need to be using those, so we may as well just mount it on this side, help make things simple. So as I said, this just screws down and the threads will go into that receiving bottom portion, which is just right here, and it will go nice and snug, and that's installed. So let's do the setup. We're going to have a test power supply over here. In this instance, we're using 12 volts, which is the same as what a car battery would be. So we have our positive lead and our negative lead here. We're going to go ahead and hook those up. Now, this pin here, which is going to be as read off and then on. So as the switch is off, we want to hook up our 12 volts constant. And as I said, a lot of this will be later explained. This is just the lab demo here on the test bench. Once we're in the car, we'll go ahead and show what these actually correspond with and how the whole circuit will work installed actually in the vehicle. Now, this is going to be, once the switch is turned on, this constant 12 volts will then pass through the circuit and then go out. So we're going to just hook on a spade connector. This is the terminal connector, comes from this kit. And go ahead and leave a couple links in the description if you'd like to pick those up. There's multiple ways you can, just hook this up as long as the connection is made. I like to do it with these. This is just a test demo, so obviously the gauge, the wiring is very thin compared to what we'll be using in the actual vehicle. Now, we'll go ahead and connect to pin number 1 on the push button switch. Let's go ahead, and if you want to get a view here, there's a little bit of a window. This is very similar to car amplifiers. If you work with aftermarket stereos, it's the same concept. You just screw this down. There's a little door that will close and then clamp onto the wire. So we'll go ahead and feed that in here. And I've joined mine with a small jumper wire, and we'll explain that in a moment. And so once the switch is then turned on, the 12 volts constant will then pass through and be provided to pin 1 on our actual push button switch. We then need a jumper wire to go up to 4. In reality, it could go to 3 or 4. In our situation, we see that 4 is on this side, so we'll go ahead and connect it to that. As we showed earlier, as long as this is pressed in, it'll pass the current through to that receiving pin or the other side. So it could be on 3 or 4. In this instance, we're just going to do it on 4, and we'll go ahead and tighten that down. And let's go ahead and actually get the demo rolling. We're going to hook up this multimeter here. We're going to go to DC voltage. If you have one such as these Harbor Freights, these typical cheap ones, will be going on DC 20 because we're working with voltage under 20. This is 12 volts. This is an auto range reader, so it can go higher or even lower if needed. And we'll just go ahead and get this hooked up. As I said, we're using a test power supply, so I'm going to go ahead and connect to the ground here. Actually, let me pass this underneath. And we're going to leave our grounds to our LEDs disconnected for now, and we'll show that in just a moment as to the whole ground part of the circuit. But let's jump into it here. As we touch the 12 volt constant, we can see we have our voltage coming in, and as we go on this side, it's not yet passing through because the circuit's closed. Let's go ahead and open it up, and we'll notice right now there's no LEDs. So you may be wondering what's going on. That's where our ground comes in for these two. Is going to be pin 2 on the actual push button, and then there's a terminal down here at the bottom. This is going to be your ground. I just have this type of connector that then helps me to do a jumper off over to ground onto this one. It's just a common ground. So I'll just need to connect into our ground here. Let me go ahead and arrange that. And as you can see, immediately we're getting our lights coming up here. Let me try to get these here. Hold on. Make sure they stay together. Oh, and we've disconnected from our ground. As I said, this is just a test demo. I haven't soldered anything together or crimped anything down, just for the demo. So we now have power. Let's check our multimeter once again. We have the original 12 volts constant. Once we switch it on, we then have 12 volts going out. We can see that as well. It's then provided over to pin 1. We can see that once again. And then the jumper brings it over to 4 for us. So we're now carrying the voltage all the way through, up and over through the jumper to pin 4. Now, when we go over to 3, we'll notice there's nothing. That's because the button is not yet depressed. So when we go ahead and do that, we can then see, as I hold it down, it then provides it through. As I let go, it's a momentary push button. It's then released. So that will lead to our starter, and that's where the relay comes in with the actual kit. So we'll go ahead and do a small cutscene here, and we'll jump to the purpose of the relay. Okay, let's go ahead and briefly discuss the relay that is included in these kits. A lot of the videos that you'll see on YouTube, they're not using the relay. I'm going to recommend that you do so because the purpose of the relay is going to go in line with power to the starter. And the push button turns the relay on, and the high amps drawn will go through the relay, not through the actual switch, which isn't going to be rated for that type of current. So you'll want to have this installed. So when we look at this, this is just a socket that the relay plugs into, and so if this happens to go out, you can easily swap it out without having to desolder everything and unhook everything, I guess you could say. So when we look at the bottom, there's going to be some different pins here, and you'll see a little bit of a diagram or a layout as to the switch. When you take a peek at the bottom, there are some numbers detailing which pin is what, and that is not necessarily so much important. We're just going to be going through the actual setup here. So on the bottom we have black for our ground. Let's go ahead and hook that onto our test power supply for ground. Now this is going to be the voltage coming in, and it will pass through the relay and go out over this wire here, which is indicated as blue on this particular relay. Now the white is a jumper wire. It's literally just passing the 12 volts through the trigger, 12 volt trigger, and then turning the relay on, which is an electromagnetic field, and you'll hear that distinct click. If you ever thought about your vehicle when you're making a turn, you have your turn signal, and you hear that distinct click. That's the electromagnetic field opening and closing, taking place, and then pass the current through to the out. So as we hook up a multimeter here, for example, let's go ahead and hook that up. The relay is now on, and when we grab our leads here, we'll go ahead and get this tested. We can touch the ground, and then we'll go ahead and touch our positive here. Once, if I can bring this back up, and let's pull it here, we can see that we have our voltage coming through. And then when we check our output, which is going to be blue, I'll bring this in, we have it as well. When we disconnect the power, you hear that click once again. The relay is now off, and we are holding our blue, and we're not seeing that power. When we go ahead and touch, there's the power once again. So that's how the relay works. Let's go ahead and hook it up into our system, and we're back now with the relay hooked up, and we'll just briefly go through the actual setup here. For those who had looked at the description, this is now jumping forward to the actual kind of meat here as to the actual setup. So once again, this is the 12 volt constant coming in. We can see here through our multimeter, if we go ahead and grab our negative here, and we just will hold on our ground. In a vehicle, this would be the chassis of the car, for example, or a common ground point, and we'll see that later as we go into the actual vehicle. So we hold down, this is going to be our constant 12 volt in. Now that we see the circuit is on, we have our main switch turned on. It's passing that voltage through, and then it leads over to our push button switch. The jumper wire brings it up to pin 4. Once again, we see the current is still there, or at least the voltage, and when we go to the out pin, there's nothing there. That's once again because it's a momentary push button. So if I go ahead and just hold this guy here for the ground, and I can go underneath here, if you can still see the screen, we'll hold on 3 and you push down. We're now seeing that pass through, and you hear that relay click. If you want to get a little bit closer to the relay, you may hear that click. Relay open, relay closed, open, and I think our ground's disconnected here. There we go. We can see that fluctuating a bit. I let go, and it drops out. Push back on, and there it is. So the setup goes, the 12 volt constant passes through into pin 1. We have a jumper going to 4. We have the red over to our relay, and then the relay needs to be grounded out over the black, of course. And then here we are with our actual output. So I'll go ahead and make sure my ground is good, and press that down, and there it is. We can see the voltage going out. Now this would go to our starter on the other, make sure it's on the other side of the relay to your output, which is blue in this particular setup. And then there we go, we have the voltage out. Now in the accessory switches, we don't have these set up currently, but we will see later in the car. You could either, there's going to be an on off, and so let me go ahead and shut this down real quick, disconnect everything. So in this setup, we see these are off, and that would be on. When we look at the sides here, we have on and off. So what you'll do is you'll take, this is your power once it's switched on. This would then, you'd have a jumper going over to the off side. And when you flip that on, you'll have this going to the actual accessory, whether it's a fuel pump or whether it's your blower motor or a fan for the radiator, whatever it may be. You would then have this as 12 volts out to that actual accessory, and that will then ground to the chassis of the car as normal. For example, with your radiator fan, you'll just take the positive 12 volt line in, and you would then lead this to it, and it would then have its own ground going into the chassis of the car already. And so you don't need to then lead another ground back from it back to your common ground here, because it'll just ground it to the car. And that setup can be explained a little bit more, as I said, once we're in the actual vehicle doing the installation. So we'll see you over there.